Thank you for listening to the Limitless Spirit podcast. This is the conversation about faith, hope, and the impact we're designed to make as Christians on the world around us. Your host, Helen Todd, the Vice President of World Missions Alliance, has spent over 2 decades traveling to the world's hotspots to meet the spiritual and physical needs of those who are desperate. She interviews guests from different walks of life whose stories, books, and ideas examine today's most pressing issues and challenges of being a Christian today and inspire you to action.
When a person suffers from traumas and from neglect or abuse, you're going to cope any way you can because you don't have the fortitude to know how to deal with that. I was sort of told to go find my own way, and I tried, and I failed miserably over and over again. This led to repeated marriages, failed, miserable marriages, full of abuse, terrible drug addiction. Because of all this, I actually found Christ through all these events that kept occurring and through my alcoholism.
My guest today, DeAnna Moore, was just explaining how she experienced a massive amount of trauma growing up and in her early adult years. And before she came to know Jesus, her life was a wreck. DeAnna had issues with drug and alcohol addiction. She struggled with mental health problems, and she was hospitalized multiple times. But she wasn't broken beyond repair. And that's what she is here to share on this episode of Limitless Spirit. This episode is about brokenness, generational sins, and how God is able to create something new and beautiful in the midst of it all. I'm your host, Helen Todd. Thanks for listening. This is another episode in our ongoing series, Greater Purpose. We've been hearing from people who discovered what their true purpose is in life after they have accepted God into their heart. For DeAnna Moore, it was a long process of healing and recovery from years of sinning and being sinned against. But as she says, even the generational curses in her family were not enough to stop God from healing her and giving her a new purpose in life, to serve as a nurse practitioner and a medical missionary. Let's jump into her story now. Hello, Dee. Thank you for coming on this podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm a little nervous about doing this, but that's just my usual anxiety performance. And I'm just so grateful that you asked me to do this.
Well, it's never easy to share your story. I think it takes a tremendous amount of courage. So I really commend you for that. But I also feel like your story has a very powerful message in it. And I'm really excited to share it with our listeners today. So let's dive right into it. You had a pretty traumatic childhood that really left an imprint on you. Can you share a little bit about that?
I grew up in the 50s. I'm 70 years old, just recently turned 70. And growing up in the 50s was like most of the people that lived in certain areas. I grew up in New Jersey, just very, very lower middle class, so to speak. And it looked like a normal family. However, there seemed to be always an unspoken tension between my mother and I. I did not feel accepted by her. And I had a disconnect from both of them. It was just a very odd feeling of growing up as an only child. My brother was born when I was 14. So that whole first generation I spent alone. It seemed, like I said on the outside, that it was normal. What turned things dramatically was when first I started showing some real grave emotional disorders. I had a lot of trouble in school. I had what today would be called ADHD, and it was untreated. I would have done a lot better probably being in an art and dance class school, but we certainly had no access to that back then. As I grew, the emotional disorders and the problems began to develop that my parents tried to ignore but couldn't. There was a lot of hurt, angry words. I wanted to run away. I wanted to commit suicide. And then I came home one day and my father told me that he had been fired. I had to ask him. It seemed I just had an intuitive sense that maybe he'd lost his job. He'd always provided a half decent income for us, for people back then with very little education for both my folks. So everything we owned was thrown into the back of a car, and we drove to Dallas, Texas. And the crime that he committed, which was embezzlement, we were wondering if he was going to go to prison. Everything just changed in my whole life. Everything I'd known about going to church was rather staunch, New England Methodist church. So it was more about kids behaving rather than hearing about the love of Christ or salvation. I knew nothing of that.
So here you are in a very traumatic situation. Your father committed embezzlement. You have strained relationship with your mom. Don't really have a foundation of knowing the personal relationship with God. I can only imagine what you were going through at that time. So is this what you feel threw you into alcohol abuse?
That was part of it, yes. Part of it, too, was by the time I did manage to barely eke by in school, I felt completely alone, which I was. I could not make friends. I found a culture in the Hispanic world when I worked as a waitress because I had to go to work, and because we were very poor. And from that, I taught myself Spanish. Since I did so poorly in school, I really couldn't get into any kind of college other than a little junior college, and I failed out of that. And my emotional disorders were showing, and people that I was around wanted me to leave. So it was abandonment, sense, and rejection. And by then, my parents' marriage was so strained. Plus, they were strapped with paying back all of his embezzlement money, which was huge, and trying to raise a little boy, my brother. So I was sort of told without being told to go find my own way. And I tried, and I failed miserably over and over again. This led to repeated marriages, failed, miserable marriages, full of abuse, terrible drug addiction. The one saving grace that came out of that was the birth of my daughter, Amber, in my third marriage. And unfortunately, by then, I had already begun to show signs of alcoholism. An event that happened that also changed things was my inebriated uncle told me one time that in a car, I was sitting there in the dark, and he said, your father's not your father. And I looked at him, I went, what do you mean? And he said, you're actually Billy Wilson is your father. I can say that today because all parties are deceased. So I set on about to try and find out what happened, and neither my mother nor my dad would disclose any information to me. They kept silent. My mother's family kept silent.
Did you know who Billy Wilson was?
No, I had no clue who. This was completely foreign to me.
And so what happened then? Did you find out eventually who your biological father was?
Well, this is where I think it's interesting that because of all this, I actually found Christ through all these events that kept occurring and through my alcohol. We began to go to the Assembly of God Church, and I started hearing the truth being taught to me and preached to me in a way I'd never heard before. And this brought conviction and salvation for me. However, when a person suffers from traumas and from neglect or abuse or misinformation or feeling betrayed or lied to, you're going to cope any way you can because you don't have the fortitude to know how to deal with that. And I didn't have any money. I did manage to get through LVN school. By my first coping mechanism was to enter a mental hospital. And through the sequence of events of being in and out of mental hospitals, and I know this will sound strange to the audience, but from that came some miracles, real miracles from God's intervention all along the way. I set out to try and finally make a path to raise my daughter by myself. I joined the Army. I failed miserably with that. Out of that, though, I was married to an Army man, and we were stationed behind the Iron Curtain. And I saw what it meant to live under communism. I saw what it meant to see people being walled up and unable to be free. Even through that, I was still a drunk. I became a bad alcoholic and all the immoralities that go with that. This impacted not only me, but my daughter, my family, and the shame of that. And when I returned, my daughter saw me strapped to a stretcher in 4-point restraint going crazy. And when I came back to the United States, that's when the bottom began to hit of me recognizing that I'd become an alcoholic, but I didn't want to admit it. And in my fifth and last mental hospital, 2 inmates, we call them inmates like you're in prison, you're not, but you're in a mental hospital. And I'm sitting there and both of them came up to me and said, we think all of us here that go to AA think you might benefit from going to Alcoholics Anonymous. We think you suffer from alcoholism.
So prior to that, you were not diagnosed as an alcoholic?
No, but then I was. After that, my doctor began to look at me differently and told me that you are an alcoholic. I was diagnosed with it. And there were other labels put on me, bipolar or severe personality disorder. There were all kinds of labels put. And I'm here to tell you that today I know that none of those labels were correct. I'm not saying those don't exist, those illnesses, but that's not what was wrong. And when I went to AA, I began to find my way to some reality of what I needed to do to look at myself and not look at my family or look at betrayal, but to look at me and to start there with God as I understood him. And I understood God to be the God of the Holy Bible. And that was the beginning of all the change that occurred. Out of that, I became sober. I began to actually work with other people in Alcoholics Anonymous who wanted to get sober. By then, I was an RN, and it changed everything in my focus. I began to recognize how selfish and self-centered I'd been living my life, how evil I had turned, and it broke my heart. But what I really saw was the damage I'd done to my daughter and to my mother and father. And I had to put aside through a lot of healing and prayer and great counsel and listening to Telling the Truth and organizations that preach the truth to you, that my sin was my own, not my parents'. Although their sins were handed down to me, what really mattered was that I faced my Savior on my own, standing there admitting I was wrong and I needed to change everything about me. And I couldn't do it without him. And I told him I was willing. And it has been an amazing ride, but it's been very challenging.
Let's pause here for a moment. So you said that during this time you became an RN, but I want to talk more about it because it was quite an extraordinary story how from being a community college dropout, you not only became an RN, but today you're a nurse practitioner. And it was nothing but God's divine intervention that got you from being on the sidelines of life, so to speak, to being a very highly qualified medical professional. And I think it's very much a part of your story. I see you, DeAnna, knowing you for many years now and having been with you on mission trips. I see you as an overcomer, and this is inspiring. So let's talk about it. How did it happen that an alcoholic college dropout, you became and nurse practitioner?
Okay. We'd have to go back to my first mental hospital. I was in there and there were LVNs and RNs taking care of me daily. I needed taking care of because physically and mentally I was completely depleted. I was close to dying and I had literally felt like I was going insane. And they were so kind to me, but they were firm and they were direct and honest. Texas Rehabilitation Commission sent people to mental hospitals back in that day and asked people if they might be interested in finding a career if they were stable enough to be released into the world. I didn't even think I would be, but my doctor told me I was. And so after 95 days in the hospital, they said, what would you like to be? And the only thing I could think of was being a nurse. All I'd ever been was a waitress, so I didn't know anything else. And they tested me and said, all right, we'll put you through LVN school. And then many years later, when I'm back in another mental hospital and I'm worse in my drinking and worse in my alcoholism and the insanity of that, again, Texas Rehab showed up and offered me RN school. So I went and received my associate degree. And I did that. I will absolutely state emphatically, I would never have been able to do that had it not been for my being in Alcoholics Anonymous and the people at my church being so supportive and believing in me. And then, interestingly enough, through AA, I met my final husband, who is the love of my life, Ken Moore, and we've been married 30 years. That is a miracle for someone who's been married 5 times to have this husband that we have grown together in AA, but together in Christianity, because he was not a Christian when I met him. Oh no, he was an angry man, an agnostic, and defiant. And he suffered from his own wounds and illnesses. And yet, out of that, not only did God bring our marriage together, and I managed to finish my bachelor degree and then move on to finish my advanced practice nurse as a family nurse practitioner. Through God's intervention, Ken found Billy Wilson, and I went and met him. And a year after knowing him, he sent me a letter telling me he was not my father. And this baffled me even more. Now I'm totally confounded with, well, then who is my father? And at the end of the letter, he gave me the name of a man that he said is my biological dad. And my husband found him a year later. And his name was John Norris. He is now deceased also. And we went and met him. And the first thing the man said to me when we met was, I'm an alcoholic. He sat down and talked to me at great length and told me my history. And then I returned to Billy Wilson. I returned to my mother. And finally, my mother disclosed some events that Billy had done to me, her first husband. Obviously, I wasn't his child, and he could not seem to accept that. And as an infant and as a toddler, things were done to me that I didn't know about. And this explained a lot of the trauma to me later in my life. Things like trying to drown me, throwing me down the stairs. My mother had to catch me to save me. At that time, I think I was 9 months old, and locking me in the closet for hours. Sometimes my mom came home from work and would find me there. These are things that would damage any child, and not knowing about it only exacerbated it. I wanted the audience to know that ties in with the generational sins of alcoholism in both parties. The Bible is absolutely right and honest with us that if we continue to live in sin and we don't repent and change, this can be handed down generation to generation. And mine was and is. But I'm responsible for the one that has to find a way out of that sin and not hand it down. It was passed to my daughter. My daughter became a heroin addict and suffered many horrible consequences. The consequences of sin are appalling, and they can kill a person, they can cause suicide, they can cause murder, and they can cause immorality. And aren't all those the things that we're dealing with today in our own country and in the world? That's why once I went to work as an advanced practice nurse, I met a man named Dr. Richard Bartlett. And Richard Bartlett was a strong Christian physician. And he invited me one day to go on a mission trip. And he introduced me to Chuck and to Helen. And out of that, now 6 years later, you're the organization I travel with. And it has changed everything in my life. There's one more key event in my life I really want everyone to understand too, actually. One is this, that where can you find the message of Christ? You think you can only find it in church, but where the seed was planted for me initially was at King of Kings movie back in 1962. And there it was in glorious Technicolor. And I saw the story of Christ for the first time in my life. And it broke my heart, a little girl at 12 who'd never really known about this. And the seed became planted, even though from that time on, I didn't think that hard about it until I went back to the Assembly of God Church. And that's when it hit me. Everything I'd heard in that movie was true. It was right there in written word, and I believed it. And today, traveling with World Mission Alliance and with being a missionary is probably the single greatest purpose I have in my life. And I can tell you that that little girl that was so damaged by her mother's alcoholism, multiple marriages, and all the immorality that goes with that, she's risen above that, and she is free from drugs and alcohol today, and she lives a life that I'm very proud of. I could not be more proud of her for what she's accomplished. She was abandoned and neglected by her mother and her father. Her father abandoned her when she was 11 months old, and he never saw her again, never provided for her. So everywhere I turned and looked in her family, in my family, in my parents' family, the sins had been handed down to each one of us. I have several uncles that died from alcoholism. My husband, alcoholism was handed down by several generations in the past. People that looked and appeared as being holy, but they were lacking the love that Paul talks about, that we need to convey to people if we're going to win them to Christ. That's what I want the audience to hear.
I didn't know you, in the life when you struggled with alcohol, and all I know is nurse practitioner DeAnna Moore, who truly has a calling on her life to help people physically and spiritually. And I think it's incredible that it was that calling to a medical profession that connected you with missions, which, as you mentioned, has become your greater purpose. So I think God just takes us on a journey. And in the end, if we surrender our life to Him like you did in your life, He brings us right where He wanted us in the first place. And I think that is the beauty of our relationship with Him. So you have been on many mission trips now with World Missions Alliance, led clinics, helped hundreds and hundreds of patients physically and spiritually. What are some of your favorite moments from your mission trips?
I think the very first one was just so amazing. There was such a sequence of events. Dr. Bartlett had to stay at the airport, and I had to fly on my way alone, not knowing anyone. And when I arrived, I was sort of lost, didn't know what to do. Many of the medications were held at the airport when he finally arrived.
Which country was it? Was it the Ethiopia trip?
Yes. And I met this most amazing man named the Rabbi Makisa Kasa, and I just was floored by the amount of love, joy, and amazing worship that these people had. And these are people who were the Jewish tribe, the original tribe of the Jewish kingdom, only they lived now in Ethiopia. And I got to be with these people, and they were poor, but they were so rich. They were full of wealth. They taught me how to love and worship and be free from demons that might be binding to you. I'd never experienced anything like that. But what else I want to convey is that working with a team of people that you've never met and that you don't know, you have to pray before you go on a mission trip. You have to know that the Holy Spirit must be present for these to be successful. And so you have to start before you leave. You have to know, look up and know a little bit about the country. Prepare yourself. Your business is to serve God when you get there. This is something you don't want to miss. I want to say something to the audience too. How did I actually find out about missions to begin with? Because I didn't know anything about missionaries. After Ken and I joined the Anglican Church, I was asked to go about 3 or 4 years into becoming an Anglican, the branch faith of Christianity that I was in. I went to a New Wineskins mission conference. There were about 700 people. I didn't know a soul. I was by myself. I was supposed to represent our church. I was very nervous. I felt inadequate to be there. And at that time, I was still an RN. And I guided myself over to a table in the corner to be alone. And suddenly about 8 men walked up, and they were obviously they were Africans. They sat down, they were bishops and priests, And one very tall, skinny, lean guy who was African sat next to me, but he wasn't a priest. He was dressed in street clothes. And as we got to talking, he introduced himself and he told me he was one of the lost boys from Sudan, and I'd had no clue what that meant. So he told me a story, and I sat there with tears running down my face, listening to a young man of 21 who had lost his entire family slaughtered by Muslims and by people who came and hatcheted their family right in front of his eyes. And he had to swim through crocodile rivers to get to the Kakuma ranch where he lived behind a fence for the next 10 years. And he never lost his faith that his parents had handed to him. And you know where that young man is today? He is a priest, and he's back in Sudan doing fabulous work to help bring children to Christ and educate them. You just never know. And that was when I first learned about it. But while I was sitting there, the bishop, a little short man with very piercing eyes and shocking white hair, turned to me and pointed his finger at me, and he said, "Woman." And I turned around and looked at him because I was scared. I was the only woman at the table. And he said, "I have something to say to you. I have something to ask you. Do you know if you have a Savior worth dying for?" And I became speechless, which is it's new for me to be speechless. And I sat there and I said, "No, sir, I don't know." And he said, "You will know. You are going to know." And that's when I began my mission journey.
That is incredible. So now that you're officially a medical missionary, how do you feel that has changed your life? How is it different from the way it was before?
In America, we've got upheaval and things going on that are disappointing or hurtful and even frightening to some of us, to those of us that love our nation. We're wondering what's going to occur. But I heard a sermon the other day, and it reminded me that my main citizenship is in heaven. And if that's true for any nation that I go to. So I don't just focus today on my self problems, which I have plenty, of course, like everyone. What I look at or try to see today is that although we have COVID, although we have many things going on that frighten us, that God calls us to not live in fear, but to trust Him and to go into the world and tell people about Jesus. So that is my primary purpose, whether it's someone in AA that's calling and asking me for help, or whether it's somebody that says, "We need you, DeAnna, to go to Serbia. That's supposed to be my next mission trip." Then I go. I don't question that today. I know what I'm supposed to do in Christ.
You put it so beautifully, DeAnna, and I know that it was emotional and perhaps even frightening for you to share your story. I think that it's a great testimony of how God puts together broken pieces in our lives, and our past doesn't matter. The past of our ancestors doesn't matter because He makes all things new. And watching your life unfold now with your marriage, your career, your calling, how God took a person that was so broken and made something beautiful out of this brokenness, to me is an incredible testimony. And I just want to tell you thank you for being brave and sharing your story.
Thank you, Helen, for inviting me.
These stories such a beautiful reminder to me that God can take your ashes and make them into something beautiful. That can be true in your life too. Jesus Christ can forgive you, heal you, and set you on a new path when you come to know Him. I love these Heart for Missions. And I wonder if her story stirred anything in your heart to learn more about what we do here at World Missions Alliance. If you're interested, check out our website, rfwma.org. There are so many things that you can get involved in and live out your dream of serving in the Great Commission. You don't have to be a nurse practitioner or a medical professional like Dee. If you have a mindset like she talked about, ready to serve God, we're here to help you fulfill this dream. Again, go to rfwma.org to learn more. One more thing to keep in mind. We are planning on a wonderful event this May, a Greater Purpose Conference. If you're looking for help in finding your greater purpose and you would like to spend time with others who are committed to serving God, I think this is a perfect place for you. There are more details on the website. Until next time, thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Limitless Spirit. I'm Helen Todd.
Limitless Spirit is produced by World Missions Alliance. If you believe in the importance of the Great Commission, sharing Christ around the world and helping those in need, check out our website, rfwma.org. If you liked what you heard, consider supporting the Limitless Spirit podcast by going to rfwma.org/give. Subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform and leave us a review. Tune in next week for another exciting episode.